It was the perfect illusion: an affluent couple, a beautiful home, and 2 children who seemed to have finally found a loving family. Jonathan and David Morgan were praised as model parents, admired for their commitment to adoption and child advocacy. Their social media painted a picture of warmth and devotion, their reputation unblemished. But behind the closed doors of their picturesque suburban home, a horror beyond imagination was unfolding. What began as a quiet cybercrime investigation soon unraveled a chilling network of deception, exploitation, and systemic failure. As law enforcement closed in, the world would soon learn the shocking truth that the Morgans were not saviors, but architects of a carefully orchestrated nightmare. The Morgans were the kind of family that everyone admired from a distance. Their home in Willow Creek, a prestigious suburban neighborhood outside Denver, was immaculate. An elegant 2-story house with a wraparound porch, freshly painted shutters, and a driveway lined with meticulously pruned hedges. Their lawn was always perfectly maintained, the flower beds bursting with seasonal colors, a reflection of the care and attention they put into their public image. Each holiday, their decorations were tasteful yet festive, never excessive, but always enough to show their participation in the community spirit. Jonathan and David Morgan had built their reputations as kind, responsible, and deeply engaged members of society. Jonathan, a financial consultant, was known for his sharp intellect and friendly demeanor, often offering pro bono financial planning sessions at community centers. David, a former teacher turned nonprofit advocate, worked with various organizations that supported child welfare initiatives. Together, they were widely respected, frequently attending charity events and engaging in philanthropic efforts. They donated to local schools, helped organize fundraisers for foster care programs, and openly championed the importance of adoption. When the couple announced their plans to adopt in 2019, the response from their circle of friends and acquaintances was overwhelmingly supportive. The adoption process had been surprisingly swift, almost too smooth in hindsight. Within a few months, they welcomed 6-year-old Ethan and 8-year-old Caleb into their home. Both boys had spent time in the foster care system, moving between temporary homes before the Morgans took them in. The adoption was celebrated as a story of hope, a tale of 2 children finally finding a forever home, with parents who had the means and the willingness to provide them with the best possible future. From the very beginning, the Morgans were meticulous in crafting the image of a loving, dedicated family. They shared carefully selected snapshots of their lives on social media, always ensuring that their posts radiated warmth and stability. Jonathan often posted heartfelt reflections on fatherhood, sharing images of weekend hikes, board game nights, and family dinners. David was active in adoption forums, encouraging prospective parents to consider fostering and advocating for more inclusive adoption policies. Their posts attracted admiration and praise, reinforcing their reputation as model parents. The boys' lives were seemingly transformed. Ethan and Caleb had their own spacious bedrooms, decorated with themes tailored to their interests. Ethan's room filled with space-themed decor, Caleb's resembling a miniature adventure lodge. Their closets were stocked with new clothes, their shelves lined with books and toys. The Morgans took them on weekend getaways to amusement parks, road trips to scenic locations, and vacations that many children could only dream of. Every milestone was documented: first day of school photos, holiday portraits, candid moments of laughter, all of it shared online for their growing network of admirers. In school, the boys appeared well-behaved and well cared for. Their teachers noted their politeness, their attentiveness in class, and their neatly prepared lunches. They were quiet but respectful, never disruptive, never drawing attention to themselves. While other children eagerly recounted their weekends or shared stories of their home lives, Ethan and Caleb rarely volunteered personal details. They always seemed watchful, as if gauging the right response before speaking. The illusion of perfection was maintained with precision. To outsiders, Jonathan and David were devoted fathers, deeply invested in their children's happiness and well-being. They attended school meetings, participated in parent-teacher conferences, and signed the boys up for various educational programs. Yet, despite their outward involvement, the boys remained isolated in subtle but significant ways. Unlike their classmates, they never had friends over for playdates. Invitations to birthday parties were rarely accepted, and if they were, the boys were always closely supervised by their parents. Sleepovers were out of the question, and their interactions with other families remained surface level. Beneath the polished veneer, small details hinted at something being slightly off. Teachers had noticed that both boys flinched at loud noises or sudden movements, though they attributed it to their time in foster care. A few neighbors recalled brief moments of unease, instances when they had seen Caleb and Ethan standing stiffly beside their fathers, their expressions unreadable. There was something controlled about their presence, something measured, as if they had been trained to present themselves a certain way. Even within their seemingly affectionate interactions, there was an element of performance. At family gatherings, the boys stayed close to their fathers, rarely speaking unless addressed directly. When praised, they responded with polite but rehearsed smiles. They never interrupted, never acted out, never exhibited the boundless energy expected of children their age. The discipline with which they carried themselves was unusual, but not alarming enough for anyone to suspect what truly lay beneath. The Morgans had perfected their deception, ensuring that no cracks appeared in their carefully constructed reality. Every detail of their lives was curated to reinforce their narrative, one of love, generosity, and selflessness. Their control over the boys' environment was absolute. They dictated who they could talk to, what they could share, and where they could go. They ensured that no one ever got too close, that no one ever had the chance to see beyond the surface. For years, their illusion remained unchallenged. To the world, they were philanthropists, role models, and devoted fathers. But inside the walls of their picturesque home, a different reality existed, one far removed from the warmth they projected. It was a carefully concealed nightmare, one that had been orchestrated with meticulous precision. And yet, as secure as their deception seemed, it would only take a single mistake for the truth to unravel. The investigation into the Morgan family's secret life began as a quiet operation within the cybercrime division of state law enforcement. The team had been monitoring an increase in encrypted online exchanges linked to a suspected digital trafficking network. For months, authorities had been tracking irregular transactions, small yet consistent cryptocurrency payments being routed through anonymous wallets designed to obscure the identities of both sender and recipient. The pattern was precise and deliberate, mirroring techniques often used by criminal syndicates engaged in illicit trade. However, this particular set of transactions bore additional markers that pointed towards something far more sinister. The trail of digital breadcrumbs led forensic analysts through a labyrinth of proxy servers, VPN rerouting, and dark web encryption layers, each step revealing new complexities in the case. These techniques, while not uncommon in financial fraud investigations, suggested a high level of technical sophistication, making it difficult to pinpoint the source. After weeks of methodical decryption efforts, the first breakthrough came when a single user account, previously hidden within a network of anonymous profiles, was traced to an IP address located in the affluent neighborhood of Willow Creek. At first, investigators hesitated. Willow Creek was home to professionals, executives, and families with impeccable reputations. It was not the kind of place they had expected to uncover such activity. But as they ran deeper analysis on the encrypted user profile, their doubts began to fade. The digital footprint bore an uncanny resemblance to data patterns associated with Jonathan Morgan, a well-respected financial consultant with no official background in cybersecurity. The methods used to conceal his online presence, however, indicated knowledge beyond what an average citizen would possess. This discrepancy raised immediate red flags, leading authorities to suspect that Morgan's identity had either been stolen or that he had far more to hide than anyone had ever imagined. Investigators initially considered the possibility of a compromised device. Perhaps someone had hacked into the Morgans' home network and used it as a cover. But as forensic analysts combed through more records, they began to notice a repeating trend. Jonathan Morgan's digital activity showed frequent use of advanced encryption tools, deleted communication logs, and systematic data masking techniques. These patterns suggested a deliberate effort to conceal online behavior. What had started as a standard inquiry had now escalated into something far more alarming. The tipping point came when forensic teams recovered a single, partially deleted file, one that had narrowly escaped permanent erasure. When decrypted, the file's contents revealed not only sensitive communications, but also a gateway to an entire hidden archive. The data was extensive, filled with references to encrypted cloud storage, anonymized transactions, and a set of disturbing chat logs that hinted at something even darker. With this evidence in hand, law enforcement moved quickly. A search warrant was obtained under emergency provisions, granting investigators full access to the Morgans' digital devices, financial records, and private communications. A specialized cybercrime unit was assigned to dissect every byte of data, bypassing multiple layers of encryption to reveal the truth hidden beneath. The discoveries surpassed their worst fears. Jonathan Morgan's personal server housed a deeply embedded cache of encrypted folders, each locked behind layers of advanced security protocols. After extensive decryption efforts, the files opened to reveal a meticulously cataloged archive of illegal material, far more organized and expansive than investigators had anticipated. The contents included chat logs spanning multiple years, transactional records of payments both sent and received, and detailed entries outlining an intricate system of digital distribution. Every detail had been carefully documented, from file sharing methods to conversations about security loopholes designed to avoid detection. The case had now moved beyond Jonathan Morgan as an individual suspect. The depth of involvement suggested that both he and his husband David were not just casual participants, but key facilitators within a larger underground network. Their records showed extensive communication with other individuals spread across multiple states, all operating with the same level of calculated precision. What investigators had uncovered was not a single isolated crime, but a sprawling, well-coordinated operation designed to function in the darkest corners of the internet. One of the most chilling aspects of the discovery was the Morgans' use of their adoptive children as pawns within this network. The record suggested that Ethan and Caleb had been subjected to a carefully controlled existence, one where their every move was monitored, their interactions restricted, and their reality shaped to ensure absolute silence. The illusion of a loving family, the frequent public advocacy for adoption, the perfectly curated social media presence, it had all been part of an elaborate deception. Even as law enforcement prepared for the next step, the Morgans remained completely unaware that the walls were closing in. Jonathan continued to work, attending financial planning meetings as if nothing had changed. David remained active in nonprofit circles, continuing his advocacy efforts without any visible sign of concern. Their social media accounts remained filled with cheerful updates, photos of family outings, and posts promoting adoption awareness. The illusion was still intact, but not for much longer. The raid on the Morgan residence was executed at dawn, carried out with military precision to prevent any destruction of evidence. A tactical team surrounded the property, moving quickly to secure all digital devices before they could be remotely wiped. Upon entering the home, officers were met with an unsettling sense of normalcy. The house was immaculately maintained, furniture neatly arranged, framed photos of the family placed strategically on the walls, and the scent of freshly brewed coffee still lingering in the air. Nothing about the environment suggested the horrors that had been uncovered in the digital realm. But as officers moved deeper into the home, the discoveries became more unsettling. A locked office concealed multiple external hard drives, each containing highly encrypted data. Burner phones were found stashed in drawers alongside handwritten logs documenting transactions, passwords, and anonymized contacts. The couple had gone to extraordinary lengths to maintain records of their activities while ensuring that none of it could be traced through conventional means. Yet the most disturbing revelation came when authorities uncovered evidence of systemic control over the children. Files stored on the Morgans' devices contained notes detailing behavioral conditioning techniques, methods designed to suppress emotional responses, manipulate trust, and enforce secrecy. Ethan and Caleb had been raised within an environment of psychological confinement, their perception of reality altered to prevent them from questioning or resisting their situation. The weight of the case took its toll even on the most seasoned investigators. What had begun as a routine cybercrime probe had now transformed into something far more horrifying. The Morgans had built an empire of deception, one that had thrived under the guise of philanthropy, advocacy, and family values. Their crimes had remained hidden not because they were invisible, but because they had been protected by the trust they had so carefully cultivated within their community. As officers escorted the children to safety, the reality of what had been uncovered settled heavily upon everyone involved. The Morgan household had been a fortress of lies, one that had successfully masked unspeakable acts for years. But now, that fortress was collapsing, and the full extent of their crimes was about to be brought into the light. As Jonathan and David Morgan carried on with their daily routines, they remained unaware that law enforcement had infiltrated the carefully crafted world they had spent years perfecting. Every morning, Jonathan left for his financial consulting job, meeting with clients and maintaining the persona of a trustworthy, analytical professional. David continued his nonprofit work, advocating for adoption reform and speaking at public events, all while portraying himself as a dedicated and compassionate parent. Their social media accounts remained active, filled with curated images of family outings, inspirational quotes about fatherhood, and updates about their involvement in charity work. Outwardly, nothing about their lives seemed amiss. Behind the scenes, however, a team of investigators was methodically dismantling the Morgans' deception. Forensic analysts had been combing through thousands of encrypted files, breaking through multiple layers of security protocols designed to erase any trace of wrongdoing. With each decrypted file, a clearer picture of the truth emerged, one that confirmed the Morgans' role not just as participants, but as key architects in a widespread, highly organized criminal network. The first major breakthrough came when digital specialists uncovered a series of unedited communication logs, hidden within an encrypted server linked to Jonathan Morgan's personal network. These logs contained years' worth of interactions with individuals across multiple states, all using anonymous aliases and complex encryption tools to disguise their identities. Some of the usernames matched profiles already flagged by the FBI's cybercrime division, individuals long suspected of being involved in trafficking digital contraband. The content of these exchanges painted a chilling portrait of an underground network that thrived on secrecy and precision. These weren't casual exchanges between criminals. They were discussions of strategy, logistics, and risk management. The messages revealed that the Morgans had provided step-by-step guidance to newer members of the network, educating them on secure storage methods, transaction laundering, and best practices for avoiding detection. They shared insights into software that could obscure digital footprints, detailed instructions on erasing metadata from files, and techniques to bypass law enforcement monitoring. The level of expertise in these exchanges made one thing abundantly clear. Jonathan and David Morgan were not passive players in this operation. They were deeply embedded within its infrastructure, actively working to sustain its existence. As law enforcement continued their investigation, another disturbing piece of evidence surfaced. Financial records that had previously gone unnoticed. A forensic audit of the Morgans' assets revealed a pattern of large wire transfers systematically funneled through offshore accounts registered under shell corporations. These companies had no legitimate business operations, no employees, no services, no revenue sources, except for the money that flowed in and out in precise, calculated intervals. The transactions were designed to be untraceable, shifting from one holding account to another, ensuring that the funds remained undetected by financial regulators. Cryptocurrency analysis revealed even more damning evidence. Investigators found multiple digital wallets tied to the Morgans, each containing significant sums of Bitcoin and Monero, cryptocurrencies favored for their anonymity. These wallets showed patterns of frequent, anonymous transactions, with individuals spread across different jurisdictions, further proving that their operation was not confined to local activity. The reach of their crimes extended far beyond what authorities had initially suspected. It was an international enterprise with deep roots in the dark web. Meanwhile, law enforcement turned their attention to the Morgans' personal and social circles, conducting extensive interviews with those who had known them for years. Most neighbors and acquaintances struggled to reconcile the horrific allegations with the warm, philanthropic couple they had come to admire. Many expressed shock, disbelief, and even guilt, wondering how they had failed to see any warning signs. Yet, as investigators probed deeper, subtle inconsistencies began to emerge. A handful of neighbors admitted that something about the Morgans' household had always felt slightly controlled, almost too perfect. Some recalled that, despite being outwardly social, the Morgans had never allowed their children to build close relationships with others. Ethan and Caleb were rarely seen playing with neighborhood kids, never attended birthday parties, and never hosted friends at their home. When questioned, teachers noted that the boys seemed withdrawn in class, never volunteering personal stories, and displaying an eerie hesitancy whenever they were asked about home life. Further accounts painted an unsettling picture. A coach at the boys' school recounted how Ethan had once hesitated when asked to join a soccer team, as though seeking approval before answering. A school counselor recalled a moment when Caleb flinched at a casual pat on the shoulder, his expression immediately blanking in a way that suggested conditioned compliance. These were small, seemingly insignificant moments at the time, brushed off as personality quirks or the lingering effects of their time in foster care. But now, in light of the evidence, those brief interactions carried a far more sinister weight. One particularly disturbing detail surfaced when a family friend recounted a memory from a holiday gathering at the Morgans' home. During a moment of laughter, Caleb accidentally spilled a drink on the floor. The immediate reaction from the child was chilling. His body tensed, his eyes widened with silent dread, and he immediately began cleaning up the mess in a manner that seemed rehearsed. The Morgans had laughed it off, reassuring everyone that it was just a habit from his foster days. But the incident had left an unease that was difficult to articulate at the time. No one had ever thought to dig deeper. The Morgans had masterfully curated their public image, ensuring that any concerns were dismissed as overprotectiveness or the challenges of raising adopted children. Their active involvement in charitable organizations and their vocal advocacy for foster care adoption made them untouchable in the eyes of their peers. They had positioned themselves as beyond suspicion, carefully weaving a narrative of generosity and compassion that shielded them from scrutiny. As investigators continued to compile evidence, it became increasingly clear that the Morgans had spent years manipulating not only their victims, but the entire community around them. Their deception had been seamless, their crimes hidden in plain sight, not because they had erased every trace, but because they had ensured that no one ever thought to question them in the first place. But now, with law enforcement closing in, their control was beginning to crumble. The intricate layers of protection they had built were being stripped away, one piece at a time. Their offshore accounts were being frozen, their anonymous identities exposed, their network unraveled. The lies they had spent years carefully maintaining were no longer impenetrable. The time was running out. The walls of deception the Morgans had so carefully constructed were collapsing, and the horrifying truth was about to be revealed to the world. The unraveling of the Morgans' operation reached a critical point when digital forensic teams decrypted an unedited communication thread buried deep within one of their encrypted hard drives. Unlike previous findings that had been fragmented or partially erased, this particular set of logs had been deliberately preserved, revealing a meticulous and uninterrupted history of exchanges between the Morgans and other high-ranking members of the same underground network. The sheer depth and detail of these conversations shattered any remaining doubts about the couple's level of involvement. They were not merely facilitators or participants, but architects of a system that thrived on secrecy, exploitation, and absolute control. The log spanned several years, chronicling thousands of interactions with individuals spread across multiple states and even reaching beyond national borders. The network was not a loosely connected collection of criminals, but a well-structured, hierarchical operation with distinct roles. Some members acted as distributors, ensuring the steady flow of illicit material. Others specialized in anonymizing transactions, laundering funds through intricate webs of cryptocurrency wallets and offshore accounts. The Morgans, however, were among those responsible for maintaining security within the network, advising others on encryption techniques, secure storage methods, and tactics for avoiding law enforcement detection. It became evident that the Morgans had played a significant role in perfecting the network's ability to remain undetected for years. Their messages revealed in-depth discussions on technological vulnerabilities, assessments of law enforcement strategies, and even attempts to infiltrate adoption agencies under false pretenses to expand their access to potential victims. They had created detailed guides outlining best practices for covering digital tracks, including step-by-step instructions on wiping metadata from files, securely transferring encrypted content, and masking online identities. These documents weren't written as suggestions, but as firm protocols, ensuring that every member of the network adhered to the highest level of operational security. For investigators, the revelations were a breakthrough, but also a daunting confirmation of what they had feared. The Morgans were not isolated criminals operating independently, but central figures within an intricate, well-organized web of offenders who had mastered the art of digital anonymity. The data retrieved from their devices suggested the presence of dozens, potentially hundreds of others involved, ranging from direct collaborators to silent participants who relied on the network's existence for their own crimes. Each decrypted file provided another lead, another connection to a name or alias buried within the dark web. But for every new piece of evidence, the realization grew that dismantling this network would not be simple. It was too deeply entrenched, its participants too well practiced in evasion tactics. Acting quickly, law enforcement teams moved to issue additional warrants based on the evidence extracted from the Morgans' communications. Investigators traced financial transactions that had been used to process anonymous payments, linking them to offshore accounts registered under shell companies with no discernible business activity. Simultaneously, cybersecurity specialists mapped out the blockchain history of the Morgans' cryptocurrency wallets, identifying dozens of wallets that had been used to route payments through decentralized platforms to obscure their origins. These transactions revealed a web of hidden financial corridors, all designed to prevent detection while ensuring a continuous flow of profits. With this information, federal agencies coordinated a multi-state operation, launching simultaneous raids on known associates who had engaged with the Morgans in their digital dealings. The goal was to sever the network's infrastructure, cutting off not just the individuals involved, but the mechanisms that had allowed them to function undetected for so long. Teams moved swiftly, targeting key locations where data storage facilities and secondary servers were suspected to exist. Several arrests were made, each yielding new leads, but the complexity of the operation meant that every step forward revealed another layer to the network's depth. However, just as law enforcement was preparing for the next phase of their takedown, an unexpected complication arose. One of the key individuals named in the decrypted logs, a frequent correspondent of Jonathan Morgan, vanished without a trace. His digital footprint, once extensive and well-documented, was erased overnight. Every known alias disappeared, cryptocurrency wallets were emptied, and online accounts were systematically deleted. It was as if he had never existed. This disappearance sent shockwaves through the investigative team. The sudden vanishing of such a central figure suggested one thing: someone within the network had been alerted to the investigation and was actively working to cover their tracks. This was not the panicked reaction of a low-level operative, but the calculated response of someone who had anticipated this moment and had a pre-arranged escape plan in place. Authorities scrambled to contain the situation, knowing that if one suspect had managed to erase their identity, others might soon follow. Forensic teams worked around the clock, accelerating their efforts to decrypt the remaining files before more members of the network had the chance to disappear. Surveillance operations were intensified, targeting known addresses and monitoring online activity in real time to detect any sudden shifts in behavior. Meanwhile, cybersecurity analysts combed through the dark web, searching for signs that other members of the ring were exchanging information on how to evade capture. The sense of urgency within law enforcement reached a fever pitch. If too many suspects went dark, the opportunity to dismantle the network at its core would be lost, and they would be forced to start again from fragments of digital evidence that could take months, if not years, to piece together. The window for action was closing rapidly. As pressure mounted, agents uncovered another alarming detail. Several of the suspects being tracked had already begun liquidating assets. Properties linked to known members of the network were being sold, vehicles abandoned, and bank accounts drained. These were not ordinary criminals. They were individuals who had operated in the shadows for years, who understood the importance of disappearing before law enforcement had the chance to tighten its grip. The investigation now became a race against time. While authorities had successfully arrested the Morgans and secured irrefutable evidence against them, the true extent of their operation was still unfolding. The more investigators uncovered, the clearer it became that this case extended far beyond two individuals. It was a sprawling, deeply rooted system that had flourished in secrecy for years, one that had contingency plans in place for exactly this scenario. As law enforcement agencies continued their pursuit, one chilling question remained unanswered. How many more had already slipped away, vanishing into the digital void, waiting for the moment to rebuild the network in another form? The race was no longer just to convict the Morgans. It was to prevent others from slipping through the cracks before justice could be served. The trial of Jonathan and David Morgan became one of the most widely followed criminal proceedings in recent history. From the moment the indictment was announced, the case dominated news cycles, sparking national outrage and intensifying public discourse around the failures of law enforcement, adoption agencies, and child welfare organizations that had allowed the Morgans to operate unchecked for years. The media dissected every development. Analysts debated the implications of the case on television panels, and advocacy groups rallied for harsher penalties against those who exploited vulnerable children. By the time the trial began, the courthouse was surrounded by protesters, their voices rising in anger, demanding justice for the victims. Some held signs condemning systemic failures, while others simply bore the names of Ethan and Caleb, the boys whose suffering had exposed a criminal network that stretched far beyond what anyone had initially imagined. Inside the courthouse, the public gallery was filled to capacity each day, with journalists, child welfare advocates, and legal experts closely observing the proceedings. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and every seat in the courtroom was occupied by those determined to witness justice unfold. From the first day of arguments, the prosecution was unwavering in its pursuit of the truth. Over the course of several weeks, they systematically dismantled the Morgans' carefully cultivated illusion, revealing the full extent of their crimes in painstaking detail. They laid out how the couple had created an airtight system of control, shielding their activities behind layers of deception while maintaining a facade of normalcy. The prosecution's opening statement described years of premeditation, manipulation, and exploitation, painting a horrifying picture of two men who had not only committed unspeakable acts, but had done so with meticulous precision. The evidence was overwhelming. Digital forensic experts took the stand to explain how the couple had stored, organized, and distributed illicit material using multiple layers of encryption. They presented detailed records retrieved from the Morgans' personal servers, showing a highly structured system that left no doubt about their intent. Files had been categorized, transactions meticulously logged, and correspondence with other members of their network carefully preserved. Financial records further cemented the case. Cryptocurrency transactions linked the couple to an international web of trafficking, with payments traced to offshore accounts and shell corporations used to launder funds. Perhaps the most harrowing moment of the trial came when the victims' testimonies were presented. Shielded behind protective screens, Ethan and Caleb, now under the care of child psychologists and welfare specialists, recounted their years of silent suffering. Their voices trembled as they described the fear that had governed their every action, the strict control that had dictated their lives, and the hopelessness that had convinced them no one would ever believe their truth. The courtroom was silent as they spoke, jurors shifting uncomfortably in their seats, some visibly shaken by the sheer depth of the trauma the boys had endured. The defense team, faced with insurmountable evidence, struggled to present a viable counter-argument. Their initial strategy had been to separate the two defendants, portraying Jonathan Morgan as the mastermind while arguing that David had been coerced into participation. They painted Jonathan as the dominant force, the one who had manipulated his husband into complicity, hoping to secure a lesser sentence for David. However, their argument quickly unraveled as the prosecution introduced damning evidence that proved both men had played active roles. Emails, chat logs, and recorded transactions showed that David Morgan had been just as involved in orchestrating and executing their crimes as Jonathan. His name appeared in financial ledgers detailing illicit payments. His digital signature was found authorizing encrypted communications, and his participation in secure forums dedicated to their network's expansion was undeniable. There was no indication of coercion. Both men had acted with full awareness and intent, reinforcing each other's actions rather than one dominating the other. As the trial neared its conclusion, the prosecution revealed its final, most devastating piece of evidence, an audio recording recovered from one of the Morgans' encrypted devices. In the recording, Jonathan and David discussed their crimes in cold, calculated terms. There was no guilt in their voices, no hesitation in their words. Instead, they spoke with detachment, outlining strategies to enhance their security, discussing ways to improve their operational efficiency, and even mocking the ease with which they had deceived social workers and child welfare officials. The moment the recording played, the weight of the case became inescapable. The courtroom fell into a suffocating silence as jurors absorbed the depth of the Morgans' depravity. Some shifted uncomfortably, others avoided eye contact with the defense table altogether. Even veteran court reporters, accustomed to covering high-profile criminal trials, struggled to maintain their composure. The illusion that the defense had tried to weave, that one man had been manipulated, that perhaps there had been some extenuating circumstance, was shattered beyond repair. When the jury was dismissed to deliberate, there was little doubt about the verdict. The evidence had been too compelling, the testimonies too damning, the crimes too horrifying to allow for any ambiguity. It took less than 2 hours for them to return with their decision. As they filed back into the courtroom, all eyes turned to the foreperson, who stood with a composed but resolute expression. The verdict was read aloud. Guilty on all counts. Guilty of aggravated child abuse, guilty of exploitation, guilty of conspiracy. Every charge, without exception, was met with a resounding affirmation of their guilt. Jonathan Morgan remained expressionless, his face devoid of reaction, as if he had already resigned himself to his fate. David, however, trembled visibly, his hands clenching and unclenching as the weight of the verdict settled in. There was no escaping what they had done. No more lies, no more deception. Their carefully constructed world had collapsed entirely, and the only thing left was the inescapable reality of their punishment. A week later, the sentencing hearing took place. The judge, having presided over one of the most disturbing cases in recent legal history, wasted no time in delivering a firm and unequivocal ruling. Citing the sheer scale of premeditation, the years of systemic abuse, and the irreversible damage inflicted upon their victims, the court handed down the harshest sentence allowed under the law: life in prison without the possibility of parole. In his closing remarks, the judge condemned the Morgans' actions as among the most egregious violations of trust ever seen in the courtroom. He spoke of the irreversible harm they had caused, the lives they had shattered, and the deep betrayal of the system that had once granted them the privilege of parenthood. "You weaponized trust," he stated, "and in doing so, you have forfeited your right to ever walk free again." As the final ruling was announced, the courtroom remained silent, not out of satisfaction, but out of the grim realization that no sentence, no punishment, could undo the damage that had been done. Outside, the crowd erupted in chants of justice, their voices carrying the collective relief that the Morgans' reign of terror had come to an end. Yet as the case closed, the deeper reckoning was only beginning. Advocacy groups called for systemic reform, lawmakers debated stricter regulations for child protection, and the public was forced to confront the unsettling truth that the Morgans had not acted alone. The legal battle had ended, but the fight to prevent such atrocities from happening again was far from over. The trial of Jonathan and David Morgan had concluded, but its impact would resonate for generations to come. The case had exposed the darkest corners of society, forcing a long overdue confrontation with the failures that had allowed such evil to thrive unchecked. Justice had been served, but the scars left behind would never fully heal. The conviction of Jonathan and David Morgan marked the end of their reign of deception, but the consequences of their actions stretched far beyond the confines of the courtroom. Their exposure and sentencing sent shockwaves across the nation, triggering an avalanche of scrutiny into the systems that had allowed them to operate undetected for years. The case was more than just a high-profile crime. It became a catalyst for systemic reform, forcing institutions, lawmakers, and the public to confront unsettling truths about the vulnerabilities that had been exploited. In the weeks following their sentencing, law enforcement agencies intensified their efforts to dismantle the remnants of the criminal network the Morgans had been a part of. The evidence extracted from their encrypted servers led to an expanding web of investigations, each uncovering more individuals linked to the underground ring. Several arrests were made across different states, with authorities cracking down on known associates who had engaged in similar activities. Some of the suspects had already gone into hiding, alerted by the sudden exposure of their network, but their digital footprints had not been erased fast enough. Investigators followed every lead, tracing financial transactions, retrieving deleted communications, and identifying individuals who had once felt untouchable. Federal agencies, working in conjunction with cybersecurity experts, broadened their focus to track international connections. The Morgans' dealings had extended beyond domestic borders, revealing ties to shadowy figures operating in hidden corners of the internet. Law enforcement's pursuit became relentless, understanding that while the couple's crimes had been uncovered, their downfall was merely the beginning of a much larger fight. For months, teams worked tirelessly to infiltrate encrypted networks, shut down illegal servers, and trace identities behind anonymous accounts. The efforts led to additional convictions, but the reality was sobering. While the Morgans had been among the most prominent perpetrators, the problem itself was far from eradicated. Meanwhile, as the legal system worked to punish those responsible, advocacy groups seized the momentum to push for legislative changes. The case reignited debates about the adoption system and the oversight mechanisms designed to protect vulnerable children. Investigators reviewing the Morgans' adoption records were troubled by the ease with which they had been approved, noting the lack of thorough background checks and the minimal follow-up assessments after the adoption was finalized. It was an oversight that had allowed the couple to manipulate the system, granting them unrestricted control over the lives of two defenseless children. Public pressure mounted, demanding stricter vetting processes for prospective adoptive parents. Lawmakers introduced bills aimed at strengthening child welfare policies, including more comprehensive psychological evaluations, extended post-adoption monitoring, and increased scrutiny of financial histories to detect illicit activities. Child protection agencies were urged to improve coordination with law enforcement, ensuring that any red flags, no matter how subtle, were investigated with greater urgency. The case had laid bare a hard truth. Predators did not always fit society's preconceived notions of danger. Sometimes they wore the guise of model citizens, using trust as their most effective weapon. For Ethan and Caleb, the two boys who had endured years of silent suffering, the road to healing had only just begun. Upon being removed from the Morgans' custody, they were placed into specialized care under the guidance of trauma therapists and child welfare professionals. Their psychological recovery would be slow and difficult, shaped by the scars left by years of manipulation, control, and fear. They had been forced to live under a system of absolute obedience, conditioned to believe that no one would believe them if they spoke out. Undoing that level of psychological damage would take time, patience, and a careful rebuilding of trust. Experts working with the boys emphasize the challenges of reintegration into a normal life. The simplest aspects of childhood, friendships, play, school, had been tainted by years of trauma. Every interaction had once been governed by fear, making it difficult for them to distinguish safety from danger. Their ability to trust adults had been shattered, and even in their new environment, surrounded by care and protection, their instinct was to remain guarded. Despite their newfound freedom, the lingering effects of their past remained, surfacing in moments of anxiety, nightmares, and emotional withdrawal. Mental health professionals overseeing their recovery described the long-term impact of such trauma. Survivors of sustained psychological abuse often faced struggles with identity, relationships, and self-worth. Many carried a sense of guilt and confusion, unable to fully comprehend why they had been targeted. Though they had been victims, the emotional residue of their past would not simply vanish with time. It would take years of therapy, emotional support, and stability to help them reclaim a sense of normalcy. The case of Jonathan and David Morgan forced society to reckon with the uncomfortable reality that no community, no matter how secure or affluent, was immune to such horrors. Their crimes had been committed not in the shadows, but within a world of privilege and public admiration. It was a stark reminder that evil did not always announce itself. It often moved undetected, disguised in the most unsuspecting places. Media coverage of the case eventually faded, replaced by the next scandal, the next crisis. But for those directly affected, the victims, the investigators, the advocates, the scars remained. Organizations dedicated to preventing child exploitation used the case as a rallying cry, intensifying awareness campaigns and educational programs designed to help communities recognize the warning signs of abuse. Schools introduced new training for educators, teaching them how to detect subtle behavioral changes in children who might be suffering in silence. Parents became more vigilant, understanding that the most dangerous threats were often the ones hiding in plain sight. Despite the weight of the tragedy, there was a determination to ensure that history would not repeat itself. The Morgans case had exposed flaws in the system, but it had also mobilized efforts to strengthen protections for those most vulnerable. The fight against exploitation would never be fully over, but in the aftermath of this case, there was a renewed commitment to vigilance, reform, and the unwavering belief that silence was no longer an option. The world had learned a painful lesson, one that would not be forgotten.